Picture a bustling medieval marketplace. Merchants call out their wares, children run between stalls, and men haggle over prices. But amid the noise, one sound is missing: a woman's voice. Instead, a figure stands at the center, her head encased in iron. A cruel bridle, shaped like a cage, clamps around her skull. From within it, a sharpened spike presses down onto her tongue. Each attempt to speak or even shift her mouth brings stabbing pain. Small bells attached to the mask jingle with every movement, drawing laughter from the crowd. Her crime? Not theft, not treason, not violence, simply speaking too much. This was not fiction, but reality in parts of Europe for centuries. Women accused of gossip, nagging, or challenging authority were locked into these devices and paraded like animals. The punishment was meant not only to silence them, but to remind every other woman of the dangers of having a voice. Why was speech, the most human of freedoms, seen as so threatening in a woman? Why did societies build iron cages for tongues while praising men for their words? To answer, we must journey through the fear, devices, and legacy of silencing women with chains. Across history, power has not only been measured in armies, laws, or wealth, it has also been measured in words. Speech shapes reality. It commands obedience, inspires action, spreads ideas, and questions authority. For men, speech was framed as a natural extension of leadership. But for women, speech was often cast as rebellion. A man's voice represented order, a woman's voice threatened to unravel it. This fear of women's words lies at the heart of punishments that sought to silence them. From the earliest myths, women's voices were framed as dangerous. Eve's conversation with the serpent was cast as the beginning of sin. Pandora's curiosity and words were linked to the release of suffering into the world. Ancient Greek writers described women as chatterers, their tongues sharper than swords. Roman authors like Juvenal mocked wives for their gossip, framing their voices as weapons that could emasculate men. In these stories, women's speech was never neutral. It was a source of temptation, chaos, or destruction. By the medieval era, this cultural suspicion had hardened into doctrine. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of the female tongue. One popular sermon compared a woman's speech to fire, small at first, but capable of burning down entire households. Another likened a gossiping woman to the devil's messenger, spreading corruption through words. Proverbs across Europe reflected the same anxiety. A woman-ass tongue wags faster than a mill wheel. 3 women make a market, 4 a quarrel. Silence is a woman's best garment. Each phrase drilled home the same message. Female speech was excess, disorder, danger. Why did speech provoke such fear? Because it was power. In households where women had little authority, speech became their tool of resistance. A wife who gossiped could spread secrets that damaged reputations. A mother who scolded could challenge her husband's control. A widow who gave advice might guide decisions that men believed should belong only to them. Words gave women influence beyond their prescribed roles, and influence threatened hierarchy. By branding women's speech as dangerous, societies justified punishing it. The fear of women's voices was also tied to sexuality. Laughter, singing, or flirtatious words were seen as gateways to immorality. Church writers warned that women's tongues tempted men as much as their bodies. Thus, to control women's speech was to control desire itself. This logic blurred morality and power, turning the act of speaking into an act of sin. A man who spoke boldly was a leader. A woman who did the same was shameless. Community order depended on enforcing these boundaries. Gossip trials were common in medieval towns. Women accused of speaking too much could be fined, whipped, or locked in stocks. In some cases, the crime of scolding became a formal legal category, specifically targeting women. Men rarely faced such charges. The law itself became a reflection of cultural fear. turning ordinary speech into criminal behavior when voiced by women. This fear crossed class lines. Elite women who engaged in political speech were condemned as manipulative seductresses. Queens who advised kings were accused of witchcraft or corruption. Meanwhile, ordinary women in villages were punished for market quarrels, domestic complaints, or simply being too outspoken. The scale differed, but the root was the same. A woman's voice was framed as unnatural when it reached beyond the private sphere. The silencing of women also reinforced ideals of the virtuous woman. The perfect wife was silent, modest, and obedient. Manuals of conduct advised women to hear much, speak little, and obey always. In plays and literature, comic relief often came from nagging wives, whose chatter had to be subdued. The cultural script was clear. To be respected, women had to control their tongues. To fail was to invite ridicule, punishment, or worse. By contrast, male speech was valorized. A man who debated, argued, or gave orders was admired for his authority. Philosophers, priests, and leaders built entire reputations on eloquence. Public speaking was the path to honor for men, but the path to disgrace for women. This double standard shows why the fear of women's voices was so enduring. It was less about speech itself than about preserving male control of public and private life. But fear always reveals something deeper: a recognition of power. If women's words had been meaningless, societies would not have worked so hard to suppress them. The elaborate proverbs, sermons, and punishments all point to an underlying truth: women's voices mattered. They could disrupt, they could persuade, they could expose hypocrisy. Silencing women was not about preserving peace, it was about protecting power. This historical fear of women's voices set the stage for physical instruments of control. If sermons and laws could not keep women quiet, iron and chains would. The scold's bridle, the ducking stool, and public shackles were born from this anxiety. They transformed metaphor into metal, turning the cultural fear of women's tongues into literal cages for speech. The irony is striking. Societies that praised wisdom, knowledge, and eloquence built devices to destroy them when they came from women. Words, the very foundation of human connection, were redefined as weapons when spoken by wives, mothers, or daughters. The fear of women's voices tells us less about the nature of speech than about the fragility of power. Men feared that words could unravel control, and so they built a world where silence was survival for women. Among the cruelest inventions of medieval Europe was a device that did not break bones or spill blood, but targeted something considered even more dangerous: a woman's voice. Known as the scold's bridle, the brank, or the gossip's bridle, this instrument of humiliation and pain transformed the act of speaking into torture. Its very design revealed how deeply society feared women's tongues. The bridle was forged from iron, a cage-like mask that enclosed the entire head. Bands of metal curved around the cheeks, forehead, and jaw, often locked at the back with a padlock or bolt. But the true cruelty lay inside. Fixed to the mouthpiece was a sharpened spike, sometimes flat, sometimes serrated, that pressed down on the tongue. If the woman tried to speak, the spike cut into flesh, producing blood and unbearable pain. Some versions included multiple spikes designed to pierce the tongue if the mouth moved too far in any direction. Others were heated before use, searing lips and tongue with every word. This was not a private punishment. The bridle was deliberately theatrical. Many devices were adorned with small bells that jingled whenever the wearer moved. As the woman stumbled through streets, unable to speak, the bells announced her presence. Children laughed, men jeered, and neighbors pointed. Her silence was made louder by the mockery surrounding her. She became a spectacle, a living warning to every woman who dared to gossip, argue, or challenge authority. Historical records place the scold bridle most prominently in Scotland and northern England during the 16th and 17th centuries, though similar devices appeared across Europe. Town councils and church courts often kept one or more bridles on hand, available for use against wives accused of scolding their husbands or neighbours. The crime of being a scold was deliberately vague. It could mean gossiping, quarrelling, insulting, or simply speaking too often in public. What bound these charges together was that they targeted women's voices, not men's. The punishment was designed to humiliate more than to kill. Women were paraded through markets, locked in bridles for hours or days, sometimes chained to posts while passers-by ridiculed them. The pain was constant, but not fatal. The goal was not execution, but correction, forcing silence through humiliation and suffering. Town records describe women forced to wear the bridle until their tongues swelled and bled, their faces streaked with tears as crowds watched. One infamous case from 1567 in Scotland recorded the punishment of a woman accused of quarrelling too loudly with her husband. She was marched through town in a bridle, the bells ringing as children mocked her. Another account from 1650 in Newcastle describes a woman chained in the marketplace for hours, her tongue pierced by the bridle until she fainted from blood loss. These were not rare occurrences. Court documents list dozens of such punishments, revealing how normalized the practice became. The bridle was also linked to the church. Ministers preached that women who spoke too freely disrupted the godly order of households. By enforcing silence with iron, communities believed they were preserving divine law. The device thus carried both civic and religious justification, merging patriarchy with faith. To defy the bridle was not just to defy men, but to defy God himself. The symbolism of the bridle extended beyond pain. By enclosing the head in iron, it transformed the woman into something less than human. She was no longer a wife, mother, or neighbor. She was an object of ridicule, an animal muzzled for disobedience. The comparison was intentional. The very word bridle comes from horse tack, a reminder that women were being disciplined like beasts of burden. The bells, too, echoed the treatment of livestock, marking her as property controlled through sound. Some versions of the bridle included grotesque decorations. Carved faces, devilish masks, or exaggerated features were added to heighten humiliation. In these cases, the woman became a caricature of herself, her individuality erased and replaced by a symbol of sin. The spectacle was as important as the pain, ensuring the punishment was remembered not only by the victim, but by the entire community. Yet the cruelty did not always achieve its intended effect. Some women resisted even in silence. Reports describe wives who refused to weep or bow their heads, meeting the jeers of crowds with defiant stares. Others reportedly bit against the spike, bloodying their mouths but refusing to show weakness. These small acts of resistance highlight the humanity that endured beneath the iron, reminding us that even in silence, women found ways to defy control. Comparisons with male punishments reveal the double standard. Men who insulted or argued were rarely subjected to such devices. They might face fines, imprisonment, or duels to restore honor. But their voices were never muzzled with iron. Only women were treated as dangerous for speaking too much. This disparity exposes the true purpose of the bridle, not justice, but control. It was less about curbing gossip and more about enforcing gender roles through fear. The legacy of the scold's bridle lives on in museums where rusted examples sit behind glass. Tourists stare at their cruel design, shocked that such devices were ever real. Yet their existence forces us to confront how far societies once went to police women's voices. These were not tools of rogue sadists, but sanctioned instruments of law used openly in towns across Europe. The bridle also survives in metaphor. Even today, phrases like "put a bridle on her tongue" echo the logic of silencing. The idea that a woman's words are excessive, dangerous, or in need of restraint remains ingrained in culture. The iron may be gone, but the sentiment lingers. The scold, bridle, stands as one of history's most chilling symbols of fear turned into iron. It shows how deeply societies equated women's voices with disorder, and how far they were willing to go to enforce silence. More than a device, it was a philosophy forged in steel, the belief that women's speech was not a right, but a threat to be caged. The scold's bridle may have been the most iconic device used to silence women, but it was far from the only one. Across medieval and early modern Europe, entire systems of punishment were designed to discipline women who spoke too much, argued too boldly, or refused to remain silent. These punishments did not always spill blood or take lives, but they inflicted something equally lasting: humiliation, fear, and the transformation of women's voices into public shame. Imagine a woman dragged from her home after quarreling with her husband. She is not accused of theft, treason, or murder. Her crime is scolding, nagging, gossiping, or challenging male authority. Instead of a courtroom trial, she is hauled to the town square, tied to a heavy chair known as the ducking stool. The chair is mounted on a long beam, swung out over a river or pond, then dropped into the water. The crowd cheers as she emerges, gasping for air, only to be plunged again and again until exhaustion silences her. The punishment is not about justice, it is about spectacle. The woman's words, once heard in the marketplace, are now drowned in the most literal way possible. The ducking stool became notorious in England and later colonial America. Women accused of gossip, slander, or witchcraft were subjected to this watery ordeal. Some drowned outright, others suffered illness or injury from repeated dunkings. The punishment was symbolic as much as physical. Water, tied to baptism and cleansing, was twisted into an instrument of suppression. To silence a woman with water was to wash away her defiance, making her submission a public ritual. Another widespread tool of humiliation was the pillory and stocks. While men were often placed in these devices for theft or drunkenness, women were chained there for something different: their tongues. Accused of gossip or quarrels, women were locked in wooden boards in the marketplace, their arms and heads trapped while crowds mocked and pelted them with filth. The punishment exposed them to the judgment of neighbors, branding them as moral failures rather than criminals. For men, stocks signaled misbehavior. For women, they signaled shame. Chains and shackles also played a role in silencing women. In some towns, women convicted of gossip or disobedience were literally chained to posts in the center of town. Heavy irons locked around their ankles or wrists, keeping them immobilized for hours or days. Passers-by spat insults, laughed, or ignored them entirely. The chain itself was a message. Her words had made her dangerous, and so her body had to be bound. Unlike prison, which removed people from public view, these punishments made women into living displays, lessons in silence that others could not ignore. The punishments could also extend into the household. Husbands were often granted authority to restrain wives deemed disobedient. Iron collars, chains, and cuffs were sometimes used privately, hidden from public record but spoken of in whispers. In these cases, the line between domestic discipline and public punishment blurred. The same logic prevailed. Women's tongues were dangerous, and iron was the solution. Even when not chained, women endured punishments that targeted their dignity. Haircutting, for instance, was a common penalty for gossips or women accused of immorality. Shorn hair symbolized disgrace, stripping away femininity and marking the woman as deviant. She could walk through the town free of chains, yet her silence was enforced by ridicule. This too was a form of moral chaining, binding her reputation even when her body was untouched. What makes these punishments especially revealing is the contrast with men. A man accused of slander might be fined or challenged to a duel. His voice, even when dangerous, was acknowledged as powerful enough to be met with financial or martial response. A woman accused of the same faced humiliation, chains, or drowning. Her voice was not considered powerful in itself. It was considered disorderly, animal-like, and therefore deserving of restraint. Men were punished for abusing speech. Women were punished for having it. Records from the 15th to 17th centuries show how common these practices were. In towns like Chester, York, and London, ducking stools were kept ready for use, often positioned near marketplaces where gossip was most visible. Church courts handed down sentences of public chaining for women deemed quarrelsome. Even legal documents reflect the gendered bias. Charges like common scold applied only to women, never to men. The law itself defined excessive speech as a female crime. The community dimension of these punishments cannot be ignored. Public humiliation worked only because crowds participated. Neighbors jeered, children pointed, vendors paused their trade to watch. These spectacles reinforced social order by turning punishment into theater. Each chained woman reminded the crowd of boundaries not to be crossed, and each cheer from the audience confirmed that silence was not only enforced by law, but demanded by community. Yet beneath the cruelty, these punishments reveal an anxiety that would not die, the fear of female influence. Gossip was feared because it spread secrets, undermined reputations, and challenged authority. Complaints were feared because they questioned husbands, priests, and magistrates. Even laughter was feared because it suggested freedom and desire. By chaining women for these acts, society admitted that their voices carried weight. The irony is stark. The more authorities insisted women's words were meaningless, the harder they worked to silence them. The legacy of these punishments extends far beyond the devices themselves. They left behind cultural scripts that women who speak are nagging, gossipy, disruptive, that silence is virtue and speech is sin. The ducking stool, the stocks, and the iron chains may sit rusted in museums today, but their logic echoes in proverbs, stereotypes, and biases that still shape women's lives. In essence, the punishments beyond the bridle show that silencing women was not confined to a single device. It was a system, a web of humiliations designed to chain the voice, the body, and the reputation. Whether through iron muzzles, ducking stools, or shackles in the square, the message was the same. A woman who spoke too much risked not only her words, but her dignity, her safety, and her very place in society. The punishments designed to silence women, whether bridles, ducking stools, or chains, were never only about individual behavior. They were about symbolism. Each device carried a message larger than the victim herself, that the silent woman was the virtuous woman and the vocal woman was dangerous. These messages seeped into law, religion, literature, and culture, shaping ideals of femininity for centuries. The legacy of these ideals continues to echo long after the iron rusted away. At the heart of this symbolism was the contrast between silence and speech. Silence was equated with obedience, modesty, and virtue. Manuals for wives urged them to hear much and speak little. Religious texts praised the quiet spirit of a faithful woman. In paintings, virtuous women were often shown with downcast eyes and closed lips, their stillness equated with purity. Silence became the visual shorthand for female virtue. Speech, by contrast, was equated with chaos and sin. A talking woman was portrayed as nagging, gossiping, seducing, or cursing. In medieval plays, the comic scold was a stock character, a wife whose chatter drove her husband to despair. Proverbs warned of women's tongues as sharper than swords, wagging faster than mill wheels, capable of destroying homes. To open the mouth was to invite disgrace. This framing turned ordinary human communication into moral danger when voiced by women. The punishments themselves reinforced these ideals through performance. A woman paraded in a bridle was not only being silenced, she was being transformed into a living symbol of disorder, corrected. The crowd watching learned the lesson. This is what happens when a woman forgets her place. The ducking stool carried the same message. By plunging a gossiping woman into water, society dramatized the idea of cleansing impurity. The ritual was more sermon than sentence. These symbols extended into family life. Husbands were told that a good wife was a silent wife, one who obeyed without question. A woman who spoke her mind threatened not only her husband's authority, but the family's honor. Thus, silencing became not just a punishment, but an aspiration. The silent woman was celebrated, the outspoken woman feared. The idea even shaped names and reputations. In literature, characters like Shakespeare's Katharina in The Taming of the Shrew were defined by their tongues, needing correction to be marriageable. Folk tales warned of women who talked too much, always punished by humiliation or abandonment. Meanwhile, saints and heroines were praised for their silence, their voices reserved only for prayer or prophecy. These stories carved the ideal deep into culture. A woman's value lay in quietness. Yet the obsession with silence reveals an uncomfortable truth. Women's voices mattered. If they had truly been powerless, society would not have invested so heavily in restraining them. The bridle, the stool, the chains all testify to the fear that women's words could disrupt order. Gossip spread secrets, complaints challenged authority, and laughter hinted at freedom. By turning silence into an ideal, societies tried to preempt this disruption, ensuring obedience before dissent could even be spoken. The legacy of these symbols persists in modern stereotypes. Even today, outspoken women are called nagging, shrill, or too much. Female leaders are judged not only for their ideas, but for the tone of their voices. Women in workplaces are interrupted more often, their contributions dismissed as chatter rather than authority. These patterns are not accidents, they are the echoes of centuries of equating speech with disorder. The silent woman ideal also lingers in domestic expectations. Women are still told to pick their battles, to avoid being too argumentative, to preserve harmony through restraint. These pressures mirror the old cultural scripts where silence was considered the glue of family and society. A man might be praised for speaking boldly, a woman for holding her tongue. Ironically, the very punishments meant to enforce silence also immortalized the fear of women's voices. Museums displaying scold, bridles, or ducking stools now serve as reminders of how far societies went to suppress speech. These artifacts are both relics of cruelty and monuments to resistance. For every woman who bled beneath an iron spike, countless others remembered her suffering, carrying forward the knowledge that silence was not always chosen but imposed. The symbolism also influenced broader ideas of justice. Women's crimes were framed as moral failings, their punishments as purifications. Men's crimes were framed as threats to authority, their punishments as deterrents. This divide shaped legal traditions, embedding gender into the very concept of law. Even when the devices disappeared, the logic endured: women judged for character, men for conduct. Understanding this legacy matters because it shows how culture transforms punishment into ideology. The bridle was not just a device, it was a sermon in steel. The ducking stool was not just a chair, it was a baptism of silence. Chains were not just restraints, they were metaphors made flesh. Each tool declared that women's voices were dangerous and that society was righteous in extinguishing them. Today, these ideals linger in subtler chains. Social shaming, reputational attacks, and gendered stereotypes continue to silence women. The methods have changed, but the symbolism remains. To label a woman too talkative or too loud is to echo centuries of framing speech as sin. The silent woman is still held up as ideal in many cultures, even if no iron bridle enforces it. Ultimately, the legacy of these symbols is not only about the past, but about the present. They remind us that silence has never been neutral. For women, silence has been demanded, enforced, and celebrated not as a choice but as a condition of survival. To break silence was to risk chains, humiliation, or worse. To remain silent was to disappear into obedience. The ideal of the silent woman, forged in iron and water, continues to shape expectations today. And until we fully recognize this legacy, the echoes of chains will continue to rattle, long after the devices themselves have crumbled into rust. The iron bridles have rusted away, the ducking stools lie rotting in museums, the shackles once used to chain women in marketplaces have long been broken. And yet the silencing of women did not vanish with these medieval tools. It simply changed form. The chains that once cut into flesh now cut into reputation, opportunity, and credibility. In many ways, the modern world has replaced physical punishment with psychological and social ones, achieving the same outcome, discouraging women from speaking too much, too boldly, or too often. Consider how women in positions of power are treated today. A male politician who speaks forcefully is described as strong or decisive. A female politician who does the same is often labeled aggressive, shrill, or emotional. The words are not neutral, they are new shackles, subtle signals that her voice is unwelcome. In business meetings, studies repeatedly show women are interrupted more often than men, their ideas dismissed or credited to male colleagues. The bridle is gone, but the cutting spike has been replaced by dismissive laughter, eye rolls and interruptions that send the same message. Silence is safer. The digital world has made this silencing even more brutal. Social media, which promised freedom of expression, has often become a modern marketplace where women are paraded, mocked, and punished. Women who voice opinions online frequently face harassment, threats, and campaigns to discredit them. A single tweet or post can unleash a flood of abuse, echoing the medieval mob gathered around a chained woman in the square. The punishment is public, humiliating, and communal. The only escape, for many, is silence. The logic is strikingly familiar. In the past, a woman accused of gossip was chained to a post. Today, a woman accused of oversharing or complaining online is targeted with ridicule and hate. In the past, a scold's bridle pierced the tongue. Today, reputational attacks pierce careers and mental health. The continuity is undeniable. The methods evolve. The symbolism remains. Cultural expectations also reinforce these chains. In many families and communities, women are still told that a good woman knows when to stay quiet. Girls are praised for being polite, while boys are encouraged to be outspoken. This double standard begins in childhood and echoes through adulthood, shaping workplaces, politics, and even intimate relationships. Silence is framed as feminine virtue. Speech as masculine authority. The medieval proverb, "Silence is a woman's best garment," survives in subtler forms. In some parts of the world, the old punishments remain disturbingly literal. Women accused of dishonor or immorality are still paraded, beaten, or killed in honor crimes. Public shaming, though condemned in law, is practiced in tradition. Chains of reputation and family honor weigh heavily, forcing silence where iron once did. Even in supposedly modern societies, women who speak about abuse or harassment often face backlash more severe than the men they accuse. Silence is safer, speech is punished. And yet resistance persists. If history shows us anything, it is that women have never been entirely silent. They found ways to speak through song, through coded stories, through whispered networks of support. In the modern era, that resistance has taken new forms. Movements like Me Too broke centuries of forced silence, transforming individual voices into collective power. Where the scold's bridle once sought to isolate women in humiliation, digital platforms now allow solidarity. Women mocked as shrill or nagging reclaim these labels as badges of defiance. The chains rattle, but they are not unbreakable. This resistance matters because it reveals the true lesson of history. Women's voices have always been feared not because they were weak, but because they were powerful. Gossip threatened reputations, complaints exposed injustice, and laughter mocked authority. The iron bridles were proof of power, not weakness. The same is true today. The more society tries to silence women through harassment, ridicule, or double standards, the more it reveals the enduring power of their voices. The legacy of silencing also warns us. Every time a woman is dismissed as too loud, every time a survivor is disbelieved, every time a leader is mocked for her tone, we reenact the old rituals of public humiliation. The devices may be gone, but the mindset persists. Until we confront the symbolic chains, silence will remain the expected price of womanhood. Breaking these new chains requires more than laws. It requires cultural transformation. It means teaching boys and girls alike that voices matter equally. It means challenging stereotypes that frame female speech as excessive. It means refusing to accept ridicule as harmless when it functions as punishment. Above all, it means remembering that silence has been enforced, not chosen, for centuries. The story of bridles, chains, and ducking stools is not ancient history. It is a mirror. It shows us the lengths to which societies will go to suppress voices they fear. And it reminds us that the fight for speech, dignity, and equality is far from over. Women were once locked in iron for talking. Today, they are locked in invisible cages of bias, stigma, and abuse. The question is whether we will allow these new chains to persist or whether we will finally break them.